Okay, so I'm going to continue. I'm in a new location and I have notes here. So it's gonna look a little different in terms of where I'm looking, but this is part two of talking about the kind of intentions and overview of the Bourbon reforms in the 18th century. So um, I was just talking about the shift from judicial power to an increasing strengthening of executive power. And what I want to talk now about is the kind of big picture vision. There is an active vision on reclaiming America, recovering power from a too powerful colonial elite. The idea of the Bourbons is that the Habsburgs, for all their good intentions, etc., had allowed a colonial elite to become too big for its britches, to think of itself as an independent nation. The kind of ideas that we've talked about, not nation in the modern sense of nation, but we talked about the development of Creole patriotism, of an understanding of themselves as Americans, as being something related to Spain for sure, as honoring the king, as being subjects of the king, but as having a kind of um, national identity that we might call it, that having a, a claim to power that had to do with the soil that they were on, that had to do with the inheritance both uh, of of European legacy and of the legacy of indigenous um, empires and indigenous past. This does not mean that the colonial elite thought highly of indigenous people that lived, that shared the space with them. They were very much a part of a colonial hierarchy that understood indigenous people to be subordinate in all ways. But there was a sense on the part of the colonial elite that they were the proper inheritors of that that glorious history of at least the native empires that they celebrated in, sometimes fanciful ways. There was a movement called indigenismo that later develops, but really harkens back in its roots to the late 17th century when Creole patriots are romanticizing and talking about Aztecs and Incas and celebrating and claiming the American legacies of empire along with all of the European legacies. So the Bourbons come in and are critical of that cultural move, but also of the actual power that the Creole elite had. And so there's an active vision of reclaiming America as a Spanish colony and making it truly a part of Spain in a way that from the Bourbon perspective had not happened or had been lost over the course of the 17th century. They were following French models to try to do this. Um, so there's a great deal of economic reform that is happening in this time period that is very significant to colonial history and to the history of independence that will come later. These reforms were designed to squeeze profit out of the colonies and they benefited Spain, but in many cases they were quite detrimental to local economies and certainly to the local elite. The important thing for our purposes is that the colonial elite did not like many of these changes, most of these changes. They were not popular on the ground, nor did the American born clergy, nor in many instances did the popular classes. American born elites in the top administrative positions, both civil and religious, were systematically replaced by new Spanish immigrants. And these were a different kind of Spanish immigrant, different kind of Spaniard than had been coming in the 17th century. These were wealthy, educated, privileged bureaucrats. These were people with administrative experience They were wealthy, they were educated. They were not nobility, but they were wealthy, educated, privileged bureaucrats. So there developed this serious tension between peninsulares, people from the peninsula, people coming from Spain, who and the Creole elite. Peninsulares were derogatorily referred to as gachupines. In this time, that's when this term becomes comes into circulation. This played out between the upper and middle level of colonial government. It played out between bishops and priests because all of those upper levels now become Bourbon reformers and they become only occupied, those positions become exclusively occupied by peninsulares per new regulations that didn't allow American-born Spaniards to occupy those roles. So bishops and religious orders who may have been American-born, bishops and priests who were American-born, upper and middle level government who were American-born, and of course all these inspectors and tax collectors and people like that were also gachupines, were also peninsulares, and they received a lot of frustration and objection. There's a famous verse that expresses this tension really well. It was written in graffiti on a governmental palace in 1785, and it goes, El virrey muy bueno, la virreina mejor, el inspector diablo y su mujer peor. And that translates as the viceroy is very good, his wife even better. The inspector is the devil, and his wife even worse. So the inspector was the famous figure of the Bourbons, whether they were inspecting convents, monasteries, parishes, or colonial institutions, or towns, villages, local parishes, etc. This verse expressed a kind of widespread anger towards this inspector, this figure of the inspector, along with a little misogyny thrown in, but while still expressing loyalty to the colonial state. The viceroy, as a representative of the king, was an embodiment of the colonial state, but received the kind of divine right of kings that was still thought to exist within the king himself. So the criticism had not gone so far as criticizing the king or calling for any independence in any way. There was still a widespread respect for royal authority, but people were upset at tax collectors and bureaucrats and inspectors who were having an invasive impact on their lives. This is an important difference. Rebellions at this time do increase throughout the colonial period, sphere, throughout the territory. These were sometimes even major rebellions, but they were usually directed at local authority, and they tended to use the slogan, death to bad government, long live the king, or sometimes the other way around, long live the king, death to bad government. Another change at this time is the visual presence of the state as opposed to the church. Whereas previously the two were linked metaphorically and symbolically, and the visible presence of the power of the church also represented the power of the crown, there was really no formal competition between the two. In this era, the representative symbols start to change. The symbol now of sovereignty and efficiency that went along with that, the idea of sovereignty, becomes invested in the individual monarch rather than the office of the monarchy as linked to the church. So you start to see those things separated, and you start to see an emphasis on the king himself, the body of the king, rather than images of the crown. So the cult of the monarch as opposed to the monarchy, whereas before it was an abstract symbol of the monarch, you might have images of the coat of arms or of a particular monarchy intertwined with church images. Now you have the emergence of images of individual kings. You can see this in coins. There used to be a coat of arms of Castile and Aragon, but in this era it became the bust of an individual monarch, the face. Statues of kings began to be erected, and new government buildings started to be built that were competing in the space for, the previously vastly more numerous religious buildings. So now you have images of the monarchy as separate from the church, rivaling crosses and statues of saints and other religious images and church buildings in the visual landscape of colonial Latin America. In some ways, these statues and this visual landscape is a throwback to the early 16th century. These statues are leaders pictured once again as in the form of kind of Roman emperors, statuesque and powerful. Whereas before you might have the power and the sacredness in the office of the king, now it's being envisioned as the individual by the monarchs themselves. This translated into church hierarchy as well, though, because, the bishops were Bourbons. The bishops were appointed by the Spanish king, and so they themselves were Bourbons, meaning they were a part of this movement. They were a part of the reform, and they sought to take these reforms into the church. And so even though the church, the state itself was limiting the power of the church. And so, in some instances, the bishops tried to resist a little bit of the loss um, uh, of their this. Because I'm doing gestures, it's putting putting these gestures up on the screen. It's funny. So that there were tensions between the bishop and royal authority, but for the most part, the bishops were these peninsulares. They were people coming out of this new model of authority, and so the bishops themselves were taking this kind of idea of streamlining authority within the church, and so the bishops were exerting control over local priests and trying to change some of the ways that church authority worked. And there was a lot of tension between American-born clergy, therefore, and the bishops. But in terms of visual culture, you can see the same things that I was just describing in terms of the monarchy. So statues of bishops, past bishops, even began to be erected, as opposed to the emphasis on saints and other kinds of more abstract images as well. So the bishops that were there in the 18th century were Bourbons, as I said before. They were royalists, first and foremost, loyal to the crown. They were interested in obeying central authority, central royal authority. So, this representation of power as vested in the individual rather than the corporate or the office of the crown or the church was representative of a significant move toward individualism in Spanish culture and what we think of as a key part of modernization, the moving away from corporate identity to individual identity. For me, the 18th century is really the kind of transition between the past era that we call the early modern era to the era we are now in, that certainly started in the 19th century, but arguably here in the 18th century as well, um, the modern era. Uh, so I want to ask you to think about the first lecture and this lecture so far, and jot down, take a minute, pause the video, jot down any curiosities or questions or anything that isn't clear, and bring them to me in class when we move on to the next lecture. But now I want to go on to talk about the most coherent part of the Bourbons plan, which is the reform program that was specifically directed at the relationship between the church and the state. So this is important, and most people get it wrong. So I want you to listen closely to this distinction. The monarchy did not want to separate the church and the state, but rather to make the church a subordinate department within the state apparatus. So the old familial metaphor of the previous era of the church as mother and the king as father goes out of style at this time. We now really only have the king, and he is thought of as the pater familias. The king really is a patriarchal father figure envisioned as complete ruler. This is a single parent household here. The church becomes simply a subsection within the state. It's not a co-equal, relationship with the state within the patrimonial state. The church is to be clearly and completely subordinate. The old relationship is gone in this model of power. These changes would become very significant for women and Native people as well. The church loses much of its judicial power. The ecclesiastical courts don't disappear, but they are weakened in the latter half of the 18th century. And various reforms are aimed at giving civil power jurisdiction over things that previously had been the church's area of jurisdiction, particularly things having to do with marriage and sexuality, anything having to do with political power, money, crimes that were now the jurisdiction of civil courts, etc. So priests lose much of their actual on the ground power to act as judges, to negotiate, to punish, and therefore to solve problems. In the court that I studied and I spoke about a little bit in one of my lectures, where I told you that women brought about 2 times as many cases against men for sexual, marital, and domestic problems than men did against women for any reason. All of these types of cases completely cease to exist after 1780. In this particular court that I studied, there are simply no more cases at all about sexual violence, marital abuse, abandonment, etc. These kinds of cases are no longer under the jurisdiction of ecclesiastical rule. And as I mentioned before in that lecture about those court cases, women went to those court cases in large part because they did not have success in the civil courts. There were particular theological logics that they could use in ecclesiastical courts to try to pressure the priest judges to help them. It's not that those ecclesiastical courts were designed to protect women by any means, but women were able, for cultural reasons, for theological reasons, and because they learned to do so, were able to utilize particular theological understandings of the contagion of sin and of their particular nature in relationship to these ideas of the contagion of sin, to argue that the priest had a responsibility to help them in order to protect society. So they weren't arguing that the priest and these judges had an obligation to help them for their own sake, but had an obligation to protect society from the damage that was being done by their situation. And so you can listen to that and read a little bit more about that if you want to in my book and in my article. But the point is that women had learned these strategies over a long period of time. And so when the church lost jurisdiction over these areas of life, there was a period of time where women lost the only somewhat effective resource that they seemed to have to get official kind of help for solving these sorts of problems. Women would learn later in the post-independent world to use the logic of the liberal state, the logic of democracy, to argue for protection. But they had to learn a whole new way of doing that. And the colonial civil courts really were never friendly to their arguments and operated through a different kind of logic. So that has an enormous effect on women then. That's an example of one of the ways that these reforms affected people. And again, I want to stress, it's not to say that the Habsburgs or the ecclesiastical courts or the church was in any way less oppressive, less colonial, less patriarchal, less racially stratified, less white supremacist, less interested in upholding economic and racial and gender hierarchies in any way than the Bourbons were. But the strategies for doing so were different and had facilitated, because of the ways that people engaged with them, had facilitated particular kinds of local autonomy or particular kinds of solutions, which were always only partial, and they certainly allowed for all kinds of abuses as well. But when those forms of power changed, it was not only the colonial elite that was impacted by these Bourbon reforms, but it was popular classes and women and indigenous people, as well as they lost resources that they had learned to strategically use under the Habsburgs. Okay, so of course, these widespread reforms were not always implemented. The particular reforms that caused the change that I just mentioned, for instance, started to happen almost 30 years before the cases disappear. So the reforms were named in 1750, but the cases continued and didn't, full. So the reforms took a while to be enforced, to be, to have an impact, et cetera. In the big cities, it might happen very quickly, much depended on particular bishops and ecclesiastical judges, etc. But the main point is that the Bourbons tried to reduce the clergy to merely spiritual specialists, to remove them from their judicial and political power that they had held before. It tried to limit the role of the church to the activities that it perceived belonged in church. The priests became highly specialized spiritual authorities. They were no longer the moral court and judges that they were before. Now, to our modern ears, this might sound like a separation of church and state, but it really wasn't. To be a part of society and to be a part of Spain and its colonies, you still had to be a part of the church. That was really important to the crown. These kings were no less religious and no less thought of their rule as both moral and religious and political and economic and all of those sorts of things. The Inquisition was still a religious arm of political power and, in fact, became, you know, there was a deeper investment in the Inquisition by the Bourbons, arguably than under the Habsburgs, at least by the end of the 17th century. New part of the new, well, the Inquisition had always been the upper levels of the Inquisition, of the inquisitors, had always been peninsulares. You couldn't be an American-born inquisitor, but new inquisitors were sent. There was an infusion of reform-minded inquisitors and inquisitorial policies. The church was supposed to work for the crown, and nominally the king was still supposed to be a servant of the Pope. It still took his legitimacy from the Pope. This part was taken less seriously by the French Bourbons than previous Spanish monarchs. But the church itself within the state was a very important part. They didn't just neglect the church as a department within the state. In fact, they had a lot of investment in how the priests said mass, in what the churches looked like, in what the religious festivals were like. They didn't just try to minimize the importance of the church, they tried to emphasize its importance as what it was supposed to become, a spiritual department of the state, the department of the state that had authority over the moral lives of individuals and communities, but defined in ways that separated it from political and economic power that other departments of the state ought to have jurisdiction over. One of the things that the Bourbons did was also try to clearly define the different jurisdictions. If you remember, we talked about the Habsburg rule as having all kinds of overlapping jurisdictions, so that an individual might legitimately go to a number of different judges some ecclesiastical, some civil, to deal with the same problem and might sort of shop around for different solutions to their problems. The Bourbons, in their effort to streamline things, to come up with standard procedures, etc., also really tried to define different jurisdictional boundaries. So the church was not autonomous. The king appointed bishops, and the spiritual work that the priests did was still considered crucial to the colonial mission and to colonial power and the maintenance of colonial power. But the church was now supposed to be like a department of spirituality within the Christian monarchy. So this didn't happen all at once. These reforms began to be noticeable in 1750 and to increase so that the loss of judicial power is gradual. The loss of judicial power of the church is gradual. This is very important. I don't want you to think that the church is suddenly not powerful in 1700 or that it loses its judicial powers all at once. My research in local courts kind of shows that actually well into the 18th century, women are using these courts really regularly and pretty effectively until about 1780, until the very last part of the 18th century. But it's easier in local courts because the reforms get there later. You know, they just physically, geographically take longer to arrive, and it becomes more and more difficult for priests as judges to have the kind of power that they had before. And so, as I said before, women have less resources in relationship to that. Another important part of the Bourbon reforms, which affected the church and particularly local parishes and ecclesiastical courts, was centralization. This is related to the idea of the reconquest or the second conquest. Often historians talk about the 18th century as the second conquest. Um, it's it isn't only historians also who use this term, the second conquest. The Bourbons themselves talked about wanting to effect a second conquest. They meant that they wanted to make America a pure colony. And they use that language, not like a second but different Spain, which is how the Creole elite had started to talk about itself. And in some ways, they thought it had, inappropriately become. So the question is, who is being conquered in this second conquest? To a certain extent, there was a renewed interest in the conquest of native peoples who had continued resisting, expanding frontiers, making money and extracting in places that had not been effectively squeezed out by colonial rule. But it also did not escape either the American church or the colonial elite that this second conquest was aimed particularly at them. Both the Creole population and the local clergy, particularly religious orders, and particularly the Jesuits, who we haven't talked about really all that much, but the Jesuits had become too powerful from the perspective of the Bourbons. Um, there are all kinds, and in fact, they were ultimately kicked out of Spain and its colonies under the Bourbon rule. There are all kinds of political efforts at centralization, breaking up the colonies and making them answer more directly to Spain. So instead of these giant viceroyalties that they had of Peru and of New Spain, these viceroyalties start to be broken up into smaller jurisdictions and making those smaller jurisdictions directly answerable to Spain and the king in Spain. In some ways, this looked like centralization through a kind of decentralization. Um, Peter Bakewell writes a lot about this in a chapter that he calls the power of paper or the an empire of paper. Uh, you might take a look for that. Um, but he's very interested in talking about this centralization through decentralization. The church also, as I mentioned before, engaged in its own campaign of reforms, and a big part of that was centralization of power as well. So ecclesiastical centralization was complicated in its motives. Not all of it was coming from the king. Some of it, was, but some of it was actually coming from within the church itself. And this part is what is more complicated. On one hand, The bishops were regalists. They were loyalists to the king. They were following Bourbon orders. So, being regalists, they often shared Bourbon political philosophy and they were trying to engage in a kind of rationalization of the church on their own, making it more streamlined, more pure, more effective in ways that was not about subordinating it to the state, but rather strengthening it in the areas of authority that it maintained. So the bishops instigated reforms of convents and monasteries, trying to make them more austere and regimented. There were also reforms of village religious festivals, an increased attempt to control popular religion. And this came not only from the inspectors who were disturbed by the amount of money that local towns were spending on their religious festivals, but came from the bishops themselves. So there was an attempt to control and regulate and limit people's devotion to saints, which might sound strange, but it wasn't that the idea of saints went away, but that the idea that was that there were too many saints and some of them weren't even really saints and they were popular saints and they hadn't gone through the proper procedure of beatification and canonization, etc. I want this hand to go away. There we go. There were reforms aimed at tightening church control of religious orders. As you know, they were, outside officially of the authority of the bishop, although Bourbon reforms within the church started to make the religious orders more and more answerable to bishops. Now, convents and monasteries had always been, to a certain degree, under the authority of bishops because they needed the permission of bishops to exist and be funded. And there was all sorts of different kinds of jurisdictional complexities there. And the bishops had always performed visits, and tried to make sure that certain policies were being formed and being followed and listened to complaints and things like that. But the bishops now were tightening its specific reforms on convents and monasteries. So things like limiting the number of lay people who could live in convents, lay women who lived in convents, children who lived in convents, servants who lived in convents, all sorts of things. There's a lot of interesting things to look at and think about in there, but the details might be too much for right now. There was also all these moves to simplify the visual and physical appearance of churches and shrines. In many ways, these reforms were specifically aimed at cleaning up the Baroque, the toning it down, making things more regulated, less chaotic, less interpretable, less, more rational, less emotional, more logical, etc. But on the other hand, whether the bishops were regalists or not, they were also still part of the church. And the church was losing a lot of its jurisdiction. So part of ecclesiastical centralization was motivated by bishops wanting to retain their own control of areas in which their influence was waning. So, for instance, bishops started to tighten the rein on local ecclesiastical courts, giving ecclesiastical judges less power, but putting the local branches more firmly under the authority of central branches, right? In the hopes that they could still maintain more of their own power centrally. So, that's an important distinction if you're interested in the, nitty gritty of the power of the church. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is I want to say a few words about the Bourbons' approach to Native Americans. The Bourbons had a more active program of acculturation. This might sound strange when you think about what you know about the 16th century. Obviously, the Spaniards always wanted to turn Latin America into a part of Spain. They wanted to make it a part of the Spanish kingdom, and they wanted to turn Native Americans into vassals and Spanish subjects and a part of that kingdom. But much of the program for doing that allowed for and, in fact, pushed for the separation of Spanish and native cultures. So recall the two republics, the laws that attempted to keep Spaniards from living in Indian towns. Spaniards did live in Indian towns, of course, but native people could get them thrown out if they were able to get the attention of ecclesiastical and civil judges because it was officially illegal. Missionaries, the exception was missionaries and priests. Missionaries learned native languages, interpreters were used to communicate. People were taught alphabetic versions of their own language, so there was actually a spreading of literacy, of a certain kind of new literacy of indigenous language. It was an empire of inclusion, and by inclusion, I do not mean equality, but meaning everyone was meant to be brought into the empire, to the whole, but in their separate places, segregation, separation, and hierarchies. But here in the 18th century, the vision changed. The Bourbon administrators thought that part of the inefficiency of the colonies, from their perspective, had to do with the fact that so many vassals didn't even speak Spanish, didn't understand Spanish culture, continued to live like non-Spaniards in their idea. So the program of active acculturation used language of equality, of inclusion in a different kind of way. And it did not break down social hierarchies, but it was trying to incorporate indigenous people into Spanish society in a less segregated way. So this included pushing the Spanish language among native communities. In pueblos de indios, Indian towns, the plan was to appoint and pay for primary school teachers to teach Spanish and to insist that indigenous people go to these schools. Verbally and also in terms of reading and writing together with Christian doctrine. So one of, the things that was happening was education was being spread. Formal education was being spread, and actually women benefited from this to a certain degree. But this was under the purpose of acculturating indigenous people into Spanish society. Most of these communities were agricultural and had little use for these teachers, so their impact was not as large as you might think. Many came and went because of waxing and waning interests on the part of the students, and because ultimately the towns themselves ended up being forced to pay the salaries of the teachers and often didn't have the resources to do so. The Bourbons also did away completely with the laws keeping Spaniards out of Native American towns. The Bourbons thought that Spaniards living among Native people was a good thing, whereas before, the Habsburgs thought of individual Spaniards as potentially corruptive influences and wanted to try to insist on only missionaries and priests as being the ones who could live among Native people. Now, the Bourbons thought that good Spaniards were agents of culture and civilization and acculturation. So they emphasized sending Spaniards or inviting Spaniards to move into indigenous communities. There's this one particular scheme called the Children's Crusade, in which Spanish children, orphans, were sent to live in indigenous towns with the idea that their kind of essential Spanishness, their essential civilized nature would influence indigenous people from the ground up and would spread, and indigenous people would become more acculturated to Spanish culture. This reflects the fact that even though these people have what seem like modern ideas of rationalization and limiting the church to belief and spiritual practice, etc., and a whole lot of other things that we might recognize in the Enlightenment, this is still a time in which people thought that culture, behavioral characteristics, things that we might think of as learned behavior was still passed on through the blood, was still inheritable behavior. We might call it genetic or biological. That's not the language that people used then still. But this notion that Spanish children who were like 2 and 3 years old being sent into to be effectively raised by native families would somehow spread Spanish culture like a positive contagion reflects both the importance of acculturating native peoples, but also this early modern idea of where this kind of of this sort of essential Spanishness, right? Of course, it didn't work, and maybe I shouldn't say of course, but it didn't work, and all of those Spanish children ended up speaking native languages and becoming a part of native communities. So after a generation, the Children's Crusade was ended. But basically, the crown tried to promote acculturation as a part of bringing about a more unified cultural state. And they saw the church as having a key role in that. But they were implicitly criticizing the way that the religious orders had gone about doing so in the past, that they had learned native languages, allowed native people to continue a lot of their cultures. You know, they fought against a lot of those cultural practices and religious practices as well, but there was a certain kind of uh, acceptance that they couldn't eradicate everything, and that Bourbons thought that they could do a better job, and they tried to exert control over that. Okay, so that's where I'm going to stop for now, and then the next lectures will be on more specific aspects of culture.